In today's video, I'm going to be covering the topic of size and surface area. This is a fundamental topic when we go on to the gas exchange module for our biology A-level. These videos are now a little bit out of sequence, and that's just because I've had requests to cover the gas exchange topic. So I'm starting with this one, which is going to be our first video of this particular series. So let's start. All organisms need to exchange substances with their environments, whether they're a single-celled organism or they're multicellular. They all need to exchange substances with both their internal and external environment. So for internal environment, this could be glucose moving into the cells from the blood supply, and with our external environment, this could be the release of carbon dioxide when we breathe out. So all cells need oxygen for aerobic respiration, and they also need nutrients to carry out their metabolic reactions. But cells also create waste products, and these need to be excreted. So carbon dioxide is an example of a waste product, as well as urea. Obviously carbon dioxide we breathe out, and urea is excreted in the urine. But all organisms also need to stay at a roughly constant temperature. So in humans, we need to stay at around 37 degrees. And so we need heat exchange to also occur. And the exchange of substance will depend on the surface area to volume ratio of an organism. So let's have a look at that. Smaller animals have a larger surface area to volume ratio, meaning that heat exchange occurs a lot faster. Now, this may sound slightly counterintuitive, saying that smaller animals have a larger surface area. It's not that their surface area is bigger, it's just the fact they have more surface area compared to their volume. So the way I've modelled it here is with cubes. Obviously animals don't look like cubes, but it just makes things way simpler when we work out the math. So if we imagine a small animal here measuring 1 centimetre by 1 centimetre by 1 centimetre. To work out the surface area, we have to work out the area of each face of our cube, so that's 1 times 1, and there's 6 faces, so we do 1 times 1 times 6, and that gives our cube, or our small animal, a surface area of 6 centimetres squared. In terms of volume, we times width by height by depth, and so that's 1 times 1 times 1, giving us a volume of 1 centimetre cubed. So our surface area to volume ratio is 6 to 1. With a large animal, however, here you can see I've got a stack of cubes measuring 3 centimetres by 4 centimetres by 3 centimetres. The surface area is slightly more complicated on this one because we've got 4 faces of our cube measuring 4 by 3 centimetres. And we've got 2 faces of our cube measuring 3 by 3 centimetres. So to work out our surface area, we've got 4 times 3 times 4, because there's 4 faces that measure 4 times 3, and we add 3 times 3 times 2, because we've got 2 faces that measure 3 by 3, and that equals 66 centimetres cubed. You probably won't come across a question like this in an exam giving you cube models to measure surface area by volume ratios, but just be very careful if, for example, in my large animal example, I've given you a cube where we've got different measurements. So in our first one, it's 1 by 1 by 1. That's very easy to work out the surface area to volume ratio. In our large animal, it's 3 by 4 by 3. It would have been kinder if I'd given you 4 by 4 by 4, because then, you know, all the faces for the surface area have the same measurements. But just be wary of things like that, because sometimes the maths can catch you out. You know, with exam nerves, sometimes you can miss small things like that. So we've just worked out our surface area is 66 centimetres squared. And now when we have a look at our volume, it's 4 times 3 times 3, which is 36 centimetres cubed. So our surface area to volume ratio is 11 to 6, or 1.83 to 1. So we can already see that our surface area to volume ratio in our larger animal is much smaller. So although the surface area is 11 times bigger, the volume is also much bigger. So the ratio is smaller. Now, if we were to have the same surface area to volume ratio, if our volume is 36, we would need to have a surface area of 216 centimetres squared, which I don't think is mathematically possible actually. If I'm wrong, please let me know in the comments, for any of you lot out there that are good at maths. So we can see, though, larger animals, despite having the larger surface area, also have this much bigger volume. And we'll see why this can cause problems and certain adaptations that these animals have to make in just a minute. So let's now have a look at multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms need each cell in the organism to be supplied with glucose and oxygen, and each cell also needs to remove its waste products to prevent cell damage from occurring. So if we get a build-up of waste products, this is obviously really bad for the cell and can eventually go on to damage it. Now, if we look at single-celled organisms, the substances can diffuse into or out of cells directly through the cell surface membrane. So a cell can take in oxygen very easily. Oxygen from the environment just passes through this one membrane and it's already into the cell. And similarly, things like carbon dioxide, they can just diffuse over our one cell surface membrane and they've been excreted and moved out of our single-cell organism. So the diffusion rate is really, really quick because there's a very small distance for these substances to travel. But if we look at multicelled organisms, diffusion across the outer membrane is much slower because some cells will reside much deeper in the body. So if you think about the cells in your stomach, for example, lining the inside of your stomach, these are surrounded by layers and layers of cells, which are then surrounded by, veins, and your skin is also a barrier, and they're much, much deeper in the body than, for example, the skin cells in your epidermis. So there's a much larger distance between the cells and the outside environment. So we can come across something called Fick's law. There are equations that model this law, but I haven't shown them here because I don't think you need to know them for the A-level syllabus. You might need to know them at degree level, but you certainly won't be asked to recite them. The only thing you need to know that Fick's law dictates that the rate of diffusion is affected by 3 factors, and these factors are surface area, difference in concentration, and membrane thickness. So, to give an example for each, for surface area, so for something to diffuse through, I'm going to give a slightly different example, but if you imagine I have a bucket and a glass and I leave them outside in the rain, which one's going to collect more water? Well, if I left them both outside for an hour, the bucket is going to get much more water because it's got a much bigger surface area for the rain to fall into. So, for example, something that's got a very large surface area, more oxygen is going to enter and diffuse through than if it had a much smaller surface area. So obviously water doesn't diffuse into something, whereas oxygen does, but you get the idea. In terms of difference in concentration, we know that gases like to move from areas of high pressure to low pressure, and we know that solutes like to move from areas of high concentration to low concentration to reach this equilibrium. And in terms of membrane thickness, something is much more likely to diffuse through a thinner membrane than for a thicker membrane. If I left, again, going back to my example of the rain, if I leave a piece of paper hanging up outside versus a piece of leather outside, the rain is going to soak through the paper because it's so much thinner. And, the leather is going to get much less wet than our piece of paper because the water can't penetrate it as well because it's much thicker. That's taking out of account the fact their actual material properties, just purely in terms of their thickness. So large organisms, as we've already said, have a smaller surface area to volume ratio, and that means it's difficult to exchange enough substances to supply the animal for its outer surface. So if we didn't have our lungs to breathe for us, all our interior cells would be very, very depleted of oxygen because the oxygen would diffuse through into our cells, but our skin cells would need that oxygen, and they'd use it all up, and before any more can diffuse through, they'd need more oxygen, so they would exhaust the supply, and then all our internal cells would die. So obviously that's not a very good thing for multicellular organisms evolutionarily, so that's why we've adapted these things such as lungs. So multicellular organisms require specialised organs to aid with the exchange, like I've just mentioned. The lungs aid humans and many other animals with gas exchange. And large organisms also require what's called a mass transport system. So for example, our circulatory system, and these transport things like glucose and oxygen to the cells via the blood. But mass transport systems can also carry things like antibodies when you mount an immune response, and they can carry hormones, and they can also carry the waste products in the blood. And the mass transport systems that we see in plants use xylem and phloem to transport water and solutes. Now let's move on and talk about heat exchange, because this is a very, very important part of this topic. So, as we know, metabolic activities within the cell create heat as a byproduct, and heat exchange needs to occur so that we can maintain this correct internal temperature. If we never engaged in heat exchange, we would get too hot, we'd go above our 37-degree ideal core temperature, and we'd die because we'd get too hot. And so the rate of heat loss in an organism depends on its surface area. So organisms with large volumes find it more difficult to lose heat, because if you've got a larger volume, you have this smaller surface area to volume ratio. So a hippo, for example, finds it much more difficult to lose heat than a mouse. But because of this, smaller organisms have a much higher metabolic activity, and this allows them to generate the heat they need to stay warm. So animals with compact shapes have a small surface area to volume ratio, and this minimises the heat that they can lose. Whereas animals with less compact shapes, so for example animals with large ears like the African elephant, have a larger surface area to volume ratio, and so heat loss from their surface is increased. So we can see that in elephants, their large ears are actually an adaptation that allows them to lose heat from their bodies more easily, amongst other things. An animal's environment can also cause them to have evolved in shape for appropriate heat exchange, and I'm going to give you some examples below. So on the left we can see we've got this lovely cute and fluffy looking Arctic fox, and we can see that it's got very small and compact ears, and this is because it lives in an extremely cold environment and therefore has these small ears to help minimise its heat loss to the environment. Again, heat tends to travel from areas that are very, very hot to very, very cold. So if you have a radiator on in your bedroom gets warmer unless you open the window, and then all the heat escapes out the window because the hot air moves to a colder region of air. You can see next to our lovely Arctic fox we have got, I think this is an African bat-eared fox. I can't remember what I typed into Google Images, but I think it's a bat-eared fox. And you can see that they've got these much, much larger ears. And this is because they live in a very hot environment. So having these larger ears allows them to lose more heat from their ears, and therefore it's more effective in helping to cool their body down. And on the right here we've got a European fox, and they're sort of a happy medium between the two. They don't live in very super duper hot environments, they don't live in freezing cold environments, they've got a much more ambient climate, and so you can see that they are a bit of a happy medium. So I've got sort of I don't know, I suppose we'd say average size ears. Something else I forgot to mention with foxes actually is the prominence of their faces. So the Arctic fox has a much more compact snout and nose compared to the bat-eared fox, which has a much more longer and pointy nose. Also similar to the European fox, actually, they've got quite pointed faces. I don't know if that's a adaptation for heat loss or whether it's to aid with things like hunting and burrowing. But certainly in terms of the ears, you can see how they are adapted for their environment. And heat exchange and the need for this to occur means that animals actually have a lot of behavioural and physiological adaptations. So animals with this high surface area to volume ratio also lose more water through evaporation from their surface. So small desert mammals have these specially adapted kidney structures, and they produce less urine because obviously we lose water through urine. But because they've got this high surface area, they're also actually losing a lot more water just through their skin. So they want to produce less urine so that they can hang on to this water that they've got in their body. Again, the desert is, in some parts very devoid of water. So if they lost all their water through urine, they wouldn't do very well at surviving. We can also see that small animals in very cold regions eat large amounts of things like nuts and seeds and high energy foods, and this helps fuel their high metabolisms. Small mammals also tend to have very thick layers of fur to help minimise heat loss, and they can also hibernate when the weather gets cold. Hibernation is a process where animals go into a deep sleep, and this essentially slows their metabolism down to almost nothing, so they can actually survive through the winter months. And larger organisms in hot regions find it very hard to keep cool due to their much slower heat loss. So they have increased surface areas, like we said with our elephants, they've got their very big ears, and they spend lots of time in water, which we can see with animals like hippos. They spend the majority of their day in the water. Again, elephants have the behavioural adaptation where they take up water through their trunks, and they will spray themselves so that the water on their skin takes up some of this heat, and when it evaporates off, it helps to cool them down. So let's recap what we've covered today. We've learned that all organisms need to exchange substances with their environment. We know that smaller animals have a larger surface area to volume ratio than larger animals. We know that multicellular organisms have specialised organs and a mass transport system, and this aids with the exchange of gases and other substances. We know that animals have a compact shape to minimise heat loss, but they have a less compact shape if they live in warmer climates, as this helps to maximise heat loss. And we know that animals show both physiological and behavioural adaptations to help with heat exchange. So the examples I've given here, compact shape and spending time in water. So now that we've covered this topic, have a go at the following test questions. Number 1, work out the surface area to volume ratios and order them from largest to smallest from the following information. So for animal A, they've got a surface area of 72 centimetres squared and a volume of 36 centimetres cubed. Animal B has a surface area of 84 centimetres squared and a volume of 21 centimetres cubed. And animal C has a surface area of 75 centimetres squared and 50 centimetres cubed. Number 2, give 3 examples of substances that are transported in a mass transport system. And number 3, give an example of a type of animal, so not foxes because we've spoken about them quite a lot in this video, that have differing shapes for their heat exchange in their environment, and discuss their adaptations. So you might need to do a bit of research for this question. Obviously we've covered foxes in this video, but see if you can find another example of an animal and how their shape differs across the climates they live across. And the final question, discuss the behavioural and physiological adaptations of elephants. That's all for today. I hope that cleared up some questions. As always, if you want to ask anything, please leave it in the comments, and thank you for watching.